Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Blaine Lintz joining me here. He is a former Navy SEAL pro triathlete, and he just recently got his PhD from University of South Carolina at their sports performance lab. Congratulations on that, man. How does it feel to complete that?
Feels good. Beat up after the last
But
15 years or so, but feels good to be done with the PhD and really ended on a good note with work that I was really excited to be.
awesome, man. Yeah, that's great. I'm sure everyone I've talked to that's gotten their PhD, that's basically this very similar response. There's, man, it was great, but glad it's done. And now there's more things that you can do with your time. And I'm sure there will be things like that. But again, appreciate you coming on, man. Really looking forward to chatting with you today. I have some really interesting topics, and I feel like you have a lot of cool things that you do. And so looking forward to chatting with that. Just to let the audience know, can you just maybe give a brief background on just where you got to where you're at today?
Yeah, I'll start at the beginning. I was a fat kid in middle school and I didn't like it because I was getting made fun of. Not super bad, but enough to motivate me to do something about it. And I started cycling a little bit and noticed I had the natural tendency to be good at it. And I had swam when I was younger, but I stopped. So going into freshman year of high school, I was like, oh, like I should start swimming again for I don't remember exactly why I got back into it. But anyways, after that, I ran the mile in freshman year PE and it was six flat. And I was like, whoa, like I've never been anywhere close to that before. I was always like 9 minute mile when I'm running hard. So I was like, I guess I should start doing triathlons. So I continued training, and then I did a half Ironman when I was 14. Did it again the next year when I was 15 and did some other multi-sport ultra distance races. I wasn't allowed to compete in full Ironman just because the age cutoff. And most half Ironmans also have that age cutoff, but luckily there was a 70.3 event in Washington close to where I was living at the time. So got into that for a while, and after that was looking to step it up some more. So I got into ultra marathon running. I had initially thought maybe ultra distance cycling, but my parents were worried about me falling off my bike or getting hit by a car, which in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't get into that. Got into running and ended up doing a 24-hour run when I was 16. And I did a 113 and a quarter miles during that. And I ran the first 100 miles of it in 18 hours and 26 minutes. So that was two junior world bests. And during that time, I had heard about Navy SEALs and I was like, oh, this sounds like the ultimate accomplishment that no one could call me a loser if I
Yeah.
were able to do it, right? Because I was being driven by a lot of insecurity early on, and I still am, but I'm working on that. So ended up getting connected with a guy, Dan Cirillo, who passed 2 years ago, but he mentored me for about 2 years training for buds and had a really big impact on my life. So I spent the rest of high school just going full power towards SEAL training. And right after I graduated high school and turned 18, I got the first boot camp class out. Besides some administrative hiccups in boot camp, I made it straight through all of SEAL training with class 294, and I graduated in April of 2013. After that, I checked into SEAL Team 5 where I was at for 4 years. And I've talked about this a bit before, but I think I was really driven to become a SEAL and didn't really have the continued goal in my mind to do work as a SEAL. And so for the first year while I was at SEAL Team 5, I had a lot of struggles with motivation and keeping myself focused. And it got pretty bad to the point where I was going to get kicked out of my platoon if I didn't like really turn it around fast. And so it took me a bit and it was embarrassing, but eventually I did take a look at myself and figure out what needed to be done in terms of my performance. And I've never been a super coordinated athlete, like team sport player or anything like that. So in order for me to perform well tactically, I've had to be super, super fit and just to be average at the tactical stuff. So as soon as that stuff wasn't up to my standard, I'd start performing pretty poorly. So I went full power training to make myself as good as I could be as a SEAL. And that kind of started with the introduction of powerlifting and some strongman conditioning work and all that on top of my ultra endurance background led to me actually being in pretty good shape for being a SEAL. And I was pretty proud of myself for that. So the first 2 years at Team Five were wash, and then the second 2 years I'd heard we were going to be deploying to Iraq this time, and we were expecting it to be a combat deployment. I was really taking it seriously. I wanted to be in the best shape that I possibly could be, and so on that process, I actually broke the SEAL deadlift record doing 640 pounds. It's no longer the SEAL deadlift record. And then I deployed to Iraq in the fall of 2016, and my platoon at SEAL Team 5 assisted in the clearance of Eastern Mosul. So that was good. I wouldn't want to do it again, but I'm glad to have gotten some exposure to combat before getting out, because I think people usually think SEALs get lots of combat, but it's not actually the case, especially right now. There are a lot of operators who are not actually deploying in a combat role. So during that, I knew I was going to get out after my 6 year contract, and I wanted to do something else hard. So my next thought was get a doctoral degree in something. And I needed to get a bachelor's first, so I did an online program while I was in the Navy. So got it all paid for doing that, and was able to get out of the Navy with a bachelor's. And over the next couple of years, I spent most of it in Silicon Valley doing executive protection work for extremely high net worth families, and then also working as the human performance manager for a international disaster response organization. And during that time, I found out about exercise science, like that it's an actual academic field that
Yep.
can be studied. And I got super excited about it. So I pretty immediately applied for an online master's at George Washington University, which I started in 2019. And that whole thing went really well. And I knew I wanted to get the PhD. Towards the end of that, applied to South Carolina and then started there in the fall of 21. And now I've been in South Carolina for the last 4 years, mostly working on the PhD. And then, yeah, in that time, I, for some reason, got a bug to push myself again physically. So I was like, oh, I should try dip my toes back into triathlon again and see what I can do. And I was looking at what kind of performances it would take to turn professional. And I was like, I think I can do that. So actually in my second season, I was able to produce 2 races that were so good to make me eligible to turn pro. And after that, I only actually raced in one professional race. And then I was like, I don't really want to do this. So that was another thing that was probably driven by a lot of insecurity in order to accomplish it. And it's not necessarily because I love triathlon or anything. I just wanted to do something hard, see if I could turn pro, and also learn a lot about physiology in the process. And that was one of my favorite things, is when I'm really interested in something like triathlon, I get obsessed about learning the physiology in relation to that. And so it really complements school, even though at the time it was just, I think, too much for me to take on doing Ironman training and PhD. But yeah, here we are. I just wrapped up my dissertation a couple weeks ago, and now I'm starting to figure out what's next.
Yeah, there's a ton I want to dive into with that, but what is next for you? Is it going to be like doing more research, or again, do you have a kind of an idea from that perspective? Or again, is that kind of what this period of time is? Hey, just let everything cool down and figure out from there.
Yeah, I don't have anything solid right now. The last dissertation study was working with ketone monoesters.
Okay.
And there's a bunch of positive and negative things out there when it comes to ketones and anything ketogenic or anything like that. But I do believe there are some very applicable reasons to use ketones for special operations
Yeah.
and military in general. And so I am interested in doing work with that after. Also, this is a little bit of an offshoot, but I've had my own struggles with TBI and things that have come along with that, those sorts of problems after I separated from the military in 2017. And I was fortunate enough to get reached out to by the Navy SEAL Foundation last October about participating in a study with UT Austin doing an ibogaine treatment. So I went down to Mexico for that earlier in January, and that helped me a lot. So I'd heard some big success stories about the role of ibogaine with TBI, but actually being able to experience it and observe the benefits in myself is huge. I would somehow, if there's a way to get involved with that sort of work, I would love to, even if it's a side thing. But other than that, I don't have anything solid planned right now. And I'm not actually sure if I'm going to be pursuing too many really challenging athletic goals in the immediate future.
Yeah. And one thing I did forget to mention too is you're also a coach for special operations people as well too, right? So you work with people that were in the same situation as you and you just help improve their performance. Is that like a one-to-one kind of type thing that you do there? Or?
Yeah, I have about 15 to 20 coaching clients at any one time, with probably about 75% of them being either active military or actively training for military selections. And usually I've been put in touch with them through word of mouth, and I haven't had any sort of need to bump it up from there, just because coaching 15 to 20 people while doing the PhD
Oh yeah.
has been enough. But yeah, some of those guys are active and are training for higher level selection units or selection courses like units, SEAL Team 6 or Delta Force, that sort of thing. And then some of them they're active duty and they're just looking to be as good at their job as they can be.
Yeah. What does that typically entail? Is it like a training side of things and nutrition? I'm assuming there's probably a huge recovery piece to all that as well too.
Yeah, I think one of the big benefits that I have to offer when it comes to coaching that population is I've done all the training blocks, I've gone through the workups. I even know what the facilities are like at all the spots that they go to train at. So I have an idea of what kind of timelines they're going to be having, and how much training they can fit in, and what type of training is going to probably fit in better with that training block. And even things like what the specific demands of a training block are and what characteristics need to be trained in order to perform well at those. So that's one thing. Sorry, I think, could you restate your
Yeah,
question
no,
again?
I was just kind of asking you like what it entails, right? Obviously, you mentioned there's some training that you need to do to make sure they're in a good spot, but you obviously know the ins and outs of what they have to deal with in terms of the recovery load and what they have access to and things like that. So I was just kind of curious what else you will work on with these types of clients.
Yeah, so yeah, it is mostly the physical training. I don't generally give any big nutrition or like PT recommendations, and I think I'm pretty good about letting people know if something's outside my scope and just giving pretty broad things, like broad recommendations. I think a common tendency, maybe surprisingly, is you have a lot of individuals from those communities who get interested in fad diets, and that most likely, I'd say, in the context of special operations, isn't going to be a great fit, even if it's just because when you're on deployment, you have very limited choice. In many situations, you have limited choice over what kinds of foods you have access to. So you're not going to keep doing your carnivore diet, probably, as you go through a remote deployment in the Middle East. So I tend not to give too many recommendations about nutrition besides broader overviews. I do think you should be getting enough carbs in, and I don't think most of the fad diets are going to be the best for this individual in this context.
So I would assume that it's, again, probably making sure that they're eating enough more than anything, because I would imagine more of a concern for this population.
Yeah, that's what I would think, because some of these guys, I'm programming like quite a bit of training for them on top of what they're doing. And as long as they say they feel okay and they're being like, and I feel they're being honest about it, which we do have that discussion quite a bit, and their progress is improving and all that, then we can keep that. But I've been surprised. Some of these guys are still gaining weight, and
Mm.
sometimes we actually do have a little bit of a conversation around how they can try to manage that a little bit better.
Yeah. So actually, you found that it's actually the opposite. Like some guys, you'll still find will gain weight. I wonder, does that have to do with what maybe just the types of food that they have access to? I guess really when they're on deployment and stuff like that.
Some of these guys are going through like their workups and probably on their feet for 8 to 10 hours a day sometimes, not sitting around, and doing pretty hard training on top of that. I would think even with a chill day outside the training that they probably be needing at least like 4,000 calories to support that. So yeah, some of these training trips, they don't always have the healthiest food, but I think sometimes that's okay, especially during something like land warfare where it's really physically demanding. Yeah, I'm not totally sure what the reason is, but I'd prefer they overeat than undereat.
Oh yeah, that absolutely, yeah. So from a training perspective, like you said, it's a high demand. So I'm curious, what does the training typically look like? And I'm assuming most of these guys, like their training is going to be geared towards performance with their job versus body composition? Or is that, or do you see people have body composition kind of goals too? Or is it mostly the performance side of things?
I'd say for the most part, the body composition goals come when it might be a specific use case. If someone is a SEAL and they want to go to SEAL Team 6 and they've spent the last few years more focused on lifting, so their body weight's 220 and you have to be pretty strong at running in order to do well for certain parts of the selection process to go to SEAL Team 6. In that context, there will be some awareness at least of what's happening to the body composition. And usually my approach is not to specifically address the body composition, but let's start training for the selection and I bet your weight will come down, and it does. I think that only got the second part of your
Yeah.
question, but if you could hit the first part again.
Yeah. And then what does training typically look like for these guys? What are you looking at? Is it what you said so far? It sounds like it's context dependent on what their goal is and what they're specifically like you said, if they're going for SEAL Team 6 or something like that. But I'm curious to hear what programming kind of looks like for this population.
Yeah, so for something like SEAL Team 6, there are several kind of major hurdles to get through and ends with a several month-long selection course that does have a very high attrition rate. But in order to get selected to go to that, you have to go to, I guess, an initial selection course that lasts about a week. And during that, I haven't been to it, so I don't want to speak too definitively, but my understanding is that you have to perform physically a lot in the ways that you did when you went through buds. And a lot of guys, when they finish buds in SQT and they become SEALs, they initially have a lot of an aversion to running or endurance. A lot of guys will go to the gym and try to get bigger and stronger. And so there's definitely an emphasis on having to return some of those qualities back to where they were, get really good at running again, make sure you're strong at rucking, and make sure you can do the pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, and start swimming again, because surprisingly, you swim very little as a SEAL, at least in today's SEAL. I'm sure in the 90s or something, there's a lot more going on in the water. So there's probably a lot more swimming going on. But I guess in the context of someone who is just looking to be in the best shape they can be, I will generally do something that resembles like a very, I don't know what a classic hybrid training model would be, but it's something like that, right? Like I like to focus on strength and endurance, usually very separately. I would rather spend the majority of time training the characteristics independently of each other rather than using something like metabolic conditioning or HIIT to improve performance. And I'll occasionally throw some of that stuff in if they're going to be coming into it later for whatever reason. Sometimes that sort of stuff comes up, and sometimes it's good to just, I don't actually think it's necessary, but sometimes it gives them a confidence boost because in their head, it's easy to make, I guess, do the mental gymnastics in your head, why something like CrossFit might be very applicable for like a tactical operator or something. But I try to make the case why I don't think that's necessary, always correct. And we can incorporate it a little bit if you want to, but it's not going to be the focus. So yeah, I generally prefer to train characteristics independently and then see where they're at and see what needs to be emphasized a little bit more and what can be maintained.
Yeah. I'm assuming you're talking like what they would call like Metcon type work. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like that kind of stuff. You find that's not super useful. You'd rather do more endurance type work and then strength work separately and versus combining both of them.
Yeah, and this is a little bit personal opinion with this statement, but I don't feel like doing Metcons at 4 a.m. before a long day of training, and I definitely don't want to do it at the end of a long day of training, but it is very manageable to have me go get in like a quality strength session really early and then maybe some easy endurance piece at the end of the day if needed. To me, that feels much more tolerable. Also, think it makes more sense physiologically to do that. Yeah, I very rarely use Metcons in my training unless the individual has a very specific goal related to Metcons or they just really enjoy them and want them in there. But I think with most of my clients, I'm able to make a compelling argument for why I don't think that needs to be in there too much if you are considering or you are interested in optimizing performance. And I kind of am able to show them that through, let's train with all these distinct qualities, and then we'll have you do a Metcon, and I bet you'll still do as well or better at the same Metcon that you were training a bit more specifically for previously.
And like metcons would just be like super specific to like whatever you're doing right there, right? Like they would just be super specific to that. I guess maybe what would be the other downside of doing something like a metcon specifically here, trying to combine them like from a physiological standpoint?
To me, you're right. People say you're getting better at everything, right? If you're doing like 5 rounds of some sort of strength piece in a 400-meter run, yeah, you're doing all this stuff, but like how much running did you actually do in that session? How fast was the running? And had you done a dedicated strength session followed by an actual interval like run workout with sufficient rest in order to really get the most quality you can out of that workout, you could do 5 to 10 times more volume at a faster pace running and be potentially less fatigued than you were from doing the Metcon because you crushed yourself doing it. So yeah, in my mind and just based on experience, I feel if you want to hit a bunch of different characteristics at 50%, you're not going to get as good at each of those things as you would be if you train them a bit more independently.
Because the whole goal of the Metcons, it's almost again, if you did, at least this is my understanding, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you were to do like a VO2 max test or something, it's hey, in that test, you want to obviously see what you can do at that point in time. So you want to go bulk, like you want to max out at that point, right? And so that's what a
Mhm.
Metcon is, right? Like you're trying to max, like you're trying to do it in like the quickest time possible. But like that, again, like you said there, that's not necessarily going to be the greatest from like a quality standpoint. And I'm assuming there's probably a big fatigue cost to that as well, too. And so you end up not really ever being able to perform at your best in a way because you're always trying to go like super hard, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like you said, the fatigue cost is a lot bigger. And I think in total, you end up actually just doing less training and getting less out of it.
Yeah. So what does that look like then, separating the two? What are you, I know again, you said, hey, it's going to be based on what they need. So what are some things that you're specific, are there any markers that you're specifically looking at of, hey, this person needs to focus a little bit more on this? As you said, I feel like a lot of guys generally, it's like, hey, we probably need to do a little bit more conditioning type work than strength training work. But I'm just curious if there's any markers you look at or anything like that.
Yeah, I think one of the big things initially is because some of these guys are training so much, I feel it's very important to emphasize that it's okay to be training at a low intensity, right? Like zone two or below that first threshold sort of idea. And in a lot of contexts, that might not be that important. But I think in this context where these guys are already, they're training a ton on top of an already busy work schedule, I think intensity management becomes very important. So that's something I try to stress a lot is that it's okay to dial back the intensity. It doesn't have to be hard all the time. I don't want the workouts to be like crushing you. And probably almost never am I going to have you go to failure or not leave a little bit more in the tank, at least to do another rep or two or another interval or two, that sort of thing.
Like you said, the big thing is you said they do a lot of training. Is that for their job specifically, or are you saying they do a lot of physical training in general, or both?
Oh, okay, so I'll like give some examples. So if we're doing like a close quarters combat training block, it might be a few weeks, like 3 to 4 weeks, and there we were probably spending, I just speak from my experience, but we'd usually for half the day you'd be on the range shooting, so 4 to 5 hours of shooting, and then another 4 to 5 hours on the other half of the day doing house clearance. And so that might include doing runs through a house, like learning how to clear it, learning different tactics as you clear it, using explosives or other breaching tools. And sometimes you're using sledges and sledging down a bunch of walls or having to carry a bunch of saws and stuff like that. So you're carrying a lot of weight and doing a lot of physical work with the job itself. You might also be doing something like land warfare, which at least for the West Coast SEAL teams has typically been regarded as the physically and mentally hardest training block that we do. And I would say in training, it's the hardest thing that you do as a West Coast SEAL after you finish SEAL training. And that's a couple weeks. There's usually no days off. and the days are very long. It's usually very hot out because it's in Eastern California. And you might be doing long patrols with 60 to 100 pounds, which end in a contact. And we'll do these things called immediate action drills, where you're basically having to deal with a contact in a very open desert environment. And so you're making very large strategic maneuvers to either go assault the target or retreat from it, and then figure out what you're going to do next from there. And sometimes those exercises end up going for 4 to 5 hours, and they're very physically demanding. Sometimes they would end with these ridiculous buddy carries where a bunch of guys in the platoon go down because the instructor says you got shot. You're ending that whole thing carrying a bunch of people as fast as you can to get to an extract point where a helicopter is going to come pick you up. That's just a regular day of work. And so it's already very physically demanding. And in a block like land warfare, I'm not going to have people do their usual training. We'll really take it down for that. So it might just be like 3 days a week, and a lot of it might be a little bit more deload focused, or even just something like very low rep and work up to a heavy set of 3 or whatever on your primary lift that we would normally do on this day, and then maybe an accessory movement, and that's going to be it. Because when you're outside for 12 hours a day and sometimes it's over 120 degrees, like, you usually don't need a whole lot extra.
In that situation, from a cardiovascular standpoint, what is that again where you're really going to lean on like lower intensity type work there on those
Yeah,
during those blocks?
and that's something we would do a lot in the preparation for.
Okay.
I think, yeah, it's not always easy for guys to initially make the connection between what feels hard during land warfare is all the very high intensity stuff. And so the natural conclusion is, okay, you need to train high intensity, but you're doing it for 3 weeks in a row. And usually that high intensity stuff comes after several hours of low intensity stuff. So if you're not feeling fresh enough once you get to the high intensity stuff, it doesn't matter how good you are at high intensity stuff. It's not going to happen in the way that you thought it was going to. So yeah, that's in preparation for that. I would still incorporate some high intensity work, but I am going to try and build a really big foundational base in order to support just the really high workload that they're going to go through during those blocks.
Yeah, so it sounds during those blocks, again, however long they are, and it sounds like obviously they're not doing this all the time. Like the work has already been done in that, like leading up to that, right? Because then that base is going to allow them, I would assume, at least from what I understand from a cardiovascular standpoint, is it's going to allow them to be able to handle more and recover from more intense type work. So really, training is just going to get really back down during that period of time. And like you said, from a weight training perspective, more just like deload style training, I'm sure whatever you can get in, but really training in general is just going to go down big time. And so if I heard that correctly, there's really not any extra, like in this specific block where it's super intense like that, there's not really any extra like cardiovascular type work they'll do outside of their kind of training then.
Yeah, I don't usually feel a need to add it in because I
Yeah.
know just from my experience doing it, I was pretty smoked, and I like to work out a lot, and I didn't have a ton of energy to do extra. And I know if I didn't, most of these guys probably don't feel like doing a ton extra. So unless they have some very specific goal that they need to keep training for, I'll taper off going into one of those really stressful blocks. And then we'll just try and maintain some things as much as possible, just so we're not kind of starting from being detrained, at least in all the characteristics that they're usually working on.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I know I watched I don't know if it was SEAL Team 6, I don't know what it was, but it was the Netflix documentary on them getting bin Laden. What was that, SEAL Team?
Oh, yeah, the new Netflix documentary. I just watched it too. So.
Dude, I was like, I just could not believe like all the training that went in. I was like, I was blown away. Like I have no military background and I watched that and I'm just like, man, that is insane. It makes sense how much training they have to do. So I could see where it's like, hey, you don't, now that was, I don't know how intense all of the blocks are like that. That obviously was probably a super intense one. And maybe all of them are like that, but I just was amazed at how much they had to do each day in just a short amount of time to really get things down. So I could see where it's, you don't want to add in training on top of that during that time.
Yeah, and yeah, I should clarify that. Yeah, the guys at SEAL Team 6 or the Tier 1 units are really good at what they do, and I was never at that level whatsoever. But yes, so some of those guys are insane. So you get like this group of guys that are so good at everything they do, and then you have them really focus on something like that. There's no one better in the world to do that.
Yeah, that's insane. So it sounds like when we talk training for this kind of a population, like again, you include the conditioning side of things. Do you feel like that's and we may have already hit on this, but do you feel like that's the thing that kind of holds them back and something that you need to work on more than the strength most of the time is building up their cardiovascular system and aerobic system and things like that?
Yeah, especially I'd say on average that tends to be the case. It's not like everyone, as soon as they get out of SEAL training, gravitates towards the gym. I'd say it's more common than not. But yes, sometimes it can be the other way where they went away from the gym because they don't have a natural leaning towards doing that. And then they need to work towards developing some strength. And in some cases, maybe putting on a little bit of mass is going to be helpful. But for the most part, I would say, in my opinion, I think more low intensity aerobic would be one of the low hanging fruit to improve most of the guys' performances.
The more I learn about it, man, the more I'm just like, it just helps with so many things. Could you maybe hit on? So I have a two-part question here, and we can tackle this separately or not. But one, are there any metrics that you're looking at? Are you looking at VO2 max, or do you not care about that, or is there anything that you're specifically looking at of, hey, we need to improve this? And then can you maybe hit on in general how building up your aerobic system can really just how it can help this population in general?
Yeah, so we can do first part first. Forgive me if I lose
I'll
track of
just
the second part.
yep.
Yeah, so with the metrics, I used to be a lot more scientific and calculated with how I programmed and even how I approached my own training. And then as I got further into my own triathlon training, and as I've gotten further into coaching, I've gotten actually less and less reliant on any sort of metrics. And I could talk all day about why I think VO2 max is massively overhyped in most cases. I think if you're looking for health and it is a measure that excites you or whatever, and you want it to be higher for your health, I think that's fine. But at least in the context of performance, I don't put a whole lot of stock in VO2 maxes. So I don't actually focus too much on that. Usually, actually, what I'll do more often is I might pay a little bit of attention to like heart rate and stuff, but usually it actually comes down to perceived effort and then just using regular tests that will give me an idea where they're at. And for something like strength training, that could be finishing the working sets with a set to technical failure and seeing how that relates to their perceived exertion. And then I can use that going forward to continue refining how I feel that they relate what they actually did to what they think they did. Yeah, and yeah, some of the guys will go through some of the metabolic testing as part of their human performance programs, and they'll share that information with me. And I think it's interesting to see what changes in what direction over time, especially over like years. But it's not really something that I'm going to use a whole lot and basing their training off of, unless they, I think one example would be, oh, their VO2 max was like 45 and they're about to go to a mountain warfare like course where they're going to be doing a ton of hiking at like elevation and stuff. Yeah, I don't know what it would really change because we're going to focus on the aerobic stuff a ton anyways,
Anyways,
but
yeah.
we might be even a little bit more aggressive about it and more calculated in how we do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then what I guess in general, how's the aerobic system going to help this population?
Yeah, so I think I very not maybe not very, but I am interested in pro tour cycling. So I'm like watching the Tour de France right now,
Nice.
and a lot of people get caught up in some of the power numbers that get reported. And sometimes they sound insane and sometimes they don't sound that impressive. And people make comments like, it's won in the last minute of the race or whatever. So you need lots of power. But you have to have the ability to generate that power after maybe 4 to 6 hours. And it could be on the 20th consecutive day of riding with a couple of rest days in there. But for the most part, it's pretty continuous. And I like that example because it kind of highlights that just because the race is won during this little part doesn't mean that's what the bulk of the training should be. And I think the bigger the aerobic base that you have, the easier it is to recover from anything else you're doing. And a lot of it can come at a pretty low cost. Like riding an air bike easy for 30 to 40 minutes at the end of your workout doesn't come with a whole lot of cost. It's not going to be super fatiguing. I love the air bike because it distributes the load throughout your entire body pretty well, and you're sitting on a bike seat. I personally like it for all that stuff, and I can also use the example of someone like Jakob Ingebrigtsen. I don't know if you followed the
I haven't.
Ingebrigtsens at all, but so he's a world class track and field athlete who also I think runs road races a little bit. but I believe he has the world record in the 2 mile and some other events around there. And he's primarily competing in the 1500 up to the 2 mile, and he's still training 100 plus mile weeks. So, he's competing in a race that might last as little as less than 3.5 minutes, and he's still training that much. And you see that sort of pattern in a lot of different endurance sports. So, just because they're competing in this short event doesn't mean they're not benefiting from doing a lot of training. So, I use that as a rationale to explain just because this is the part that feels hard to you when you're doing your job doesn't mean it has to be the focus of the training or even something that needs to be directly addressed very often.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It sounds, again, the big thing being it's just going to help you recover better and just handle more overall. That's been one of the cool things that I feel like I've learned about the aerobic system in general. And so, again, even someone that does short stuff like that, like you said, 3.5 minutes, like for them, it's going to be beneficial because they can recover. And I'm assuming it probably can lead to more high quality work that they can put in as well, too, there, obviously, because they're recovering faster and things like that.
Yeah. The fitter you get and the more volume you can handle, the more you can train harder. And I think overall that can just like move you along in the right direction if you think about it as this long-term process. Doing 100 mile weeks right off the bat isn't going to be helpful for all people, but if you've worked up to a point where you can do that, another example is the Norwegian triathletes, especially Christian Blumenfeld, who won the Tokyo Olympics in triathlon. And that's where I first heard about him and his coach, who's super, super interesting. But they had reported during the Olympics as he was winning that he trains for 40 hours a week. And I was like, I've never heard of this. Like, I've heard of 30 hours, maybe 35, but I've never heard it claim that someone's training 40 hours a week. And I think Christian is coming up on 30 soon. And I believe since his early teens, he's been training close to 30 to 40 hours a week, pretty consistently throughout that entire time. And what happened was after winning the Olympics, which I think he won it in an hour and 40 minutes, 3 months later, he did his first Ironman and he broke the Ironman world record, which was like 7 hours and 21 minutes, I think. I'm not exact on that, but that's pretty unheard of to go from a race like that, that's an hour 40, up to Ironman and be pretty dominant in both. And I think it's easy to make the logical jump. That would be because he was training huge volumes, even for Olympic distance, and he was able to carry it over really nicely into Ironman.
Because he had that nice base and was putting in all that time. So it allowed for him to be able to just make that transition a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Nice. Cool. I wanted to hit on this earlier, but we got into a good conversation there. What does your training look like now? I know you said it sounded like you were saying you became a pro triathlete, but that's not necessarily something you're not sure on if you want to continue to do. I'm just curious, what does your kind of training look like at this point in time?
Yeah. So I think at the end of 2023, when I turned pro, I was more than burned out. I was sick for a couple months trying to do that with school.
Well,
I felt like shit.
so like
I was
classic
getting
overtraining syndrome then at that point?
yeah, it's tough because my hormones weren't that wacky. I think a lot of it was psychological, but it was, yeah, I don't know how much the psychological contributes to getting sick, but something was up and I never fully figured it out, but I knew I felt like trash and I was getting pretty depressed, and that kind of actually ended up carrying through most of 2024. And sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was like, I need a break from that and feeling like shit. So I took a few months off, started training again in 2024, did one pro race, did really enjoy it. I was like, I don't know about this triathlon stuff right now. I'm pretty beat up. And immediately once I started training again, I was like, oh, I'm starting to feel like trashy again. So after that, I kind of was like, I'm going to focus a lot more on school because this doesn't feel good and I don't think it's worth it. And I know I'm not going to be the best in the world at triathlon, so whatever. And yeah, after that, I kind of was like, I really need to focus on my mental health a little bit more because if I don't, I'm going to dig myself into a very bad hole. And I was starting to feel like it was kind of moving in a downward direction. Since then, actually this entire year has been pretty casual when it comes to training. I run 25 to 30 miles a week, and then I'm lifting usually 2 to 4 days a week. It's not super structured. I have no performance goals right now. I've been thinking about potentially doing a 100-mile trail run sometime in the next maybe 6 to 9 months, because that's something I've been interested in doing for a long time, just because I've done 200-mile or longer runs, but they were both road or track. So I've just been interested in the trail side of things. I know all the elevation change can make it a lot harder, and it's just something I haven't experienced yet, so I'm curious about it. But yeah, my training has been nothing interesting to talk about right now. It's weird because it's the first time since I was like 20 that's been the case.
Hey, and you have good reason, right? Obviously, getting PhD and stuff like that's going to take up a lot of time. And I think it just goes to show that, like, someone that's in great shape like yourself, you put so much load on the body, man, and it's hard to freaking recover, even if you're used to doing it. And we all need to. I think it just goes to show you need to focus on one thing, and it's hard to balance everything at one time. I feel like.
Yeah.
Especially the more you do, especially with something like being a triathlete as well too. That's a lot of just overall work in general. So it sounds like your training right now, it's more so just maintaining, like almost maintaining what you have in terms of base of aerobic base and strength base from that perspective.
Yeah, I don't even know if I'd say I'm maintaining any previous fitness, but I'm maintaining something, and I'm not in horrible shape or anything. And yeah, lifting is fine, but it's very hard for me to train or do anything with full focus unless I have a clear goal related to it. And I have a bad habit of not doing things that I don't want to do 100%. So it's either kind of 100% or not at all. And so luckily with exercise, I've been able to find some compromise, and I am still like doing stuff, but relative to what it was before, it feels like not at all.
So you do it just more so because what I'm assuming, like, you enjoy it a little bit and it just kind of feels good, and or is it like, hey, I just know that I probably need to do at least a little bit there.
Yeah, it's a combination of both. I've been trail running a lot. I just have found it enjoyable, and it's important to me after I had my period of being in bad shape when I was like 20, when I first got to SEAL Team 5. It's been really important to me since then that I maintain a consistent routine with some form of exercise. So it's not as fun when I don't have something I'm training for, but I don't have any issues with motivation or anything. I'm still like doing something almost every day.
Yeah, yeah. And then, like, strength wise, you said it's usually 2 to 4 times a week. Are you just, is it more technically strength work, or do you do like some hypertrophy kind of work in combination? Or you mentioned there's not really too much structure with it. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's the least structured my lifting has been since, the last 10 years or so. But I'd say for upper body, I'm training hypertrophy, and then my lower body, I don't love lifting high volume with my lower body.
Yeah.
So I might do something like work up to a heavy set of three or four doubles or something, RP eight, and then do an accessory lift and some ab exercises or something. And it's enough to maintain my strength, but I'll probably do something like that once a week, maybe two upper body hypertrophy days a week. And then I might do another session with like blood flow restriction, because I have felt like it's a nice addition to my training that doesn't seem to really fatigue me as much as like a heavy session would.
Yeah, because you want to find that nice kind of balance there so you can do the amount of running that you want to do as well, too.
Yeah. And as much as I like the idea of having a strong lower body, running has been the most enjoyable form of running or form of exercise lately. And I do feel like in any level of volume, lower body lifting does mess with it in a way that I just haven't loved lately, because I have no performance goals. So that's why the lower body stuff I've only been doing like once a week, and it's really just to maintain.
I feel like like you said, high volume lower body training, man, I do feel like that would, when you have multiple goals like this, or again, you are focused on maybe a little bit more volume from an endurance standpoint. I just feel like those two would be somewhat conflicting in most situations there. I'm assuming obviously depends on the person, but I would say generally speaking, that would be the case.
Yeah, and for the most part, if I was coaching someone or focused on my own goals, unless there's a specific reason to incorporate high volume lower body lifting, like I'm trying to condition the muscle a little bit better to handle eccentric loading with something like an ultra marathon without necessarily having to run super high volumes to accomplish it. Unless you're doing that, I probably am going to opt for a little bit higher intensity, lower volume, in order to just minimize the impact of fatigue from that on the rest of the training.
Yeah. So I did want to ask you about your nutrition. And again, maybe based on kind of what you said about your training, is there anything specific there that you're focused on in terms of the nutrition side, or is it just, again, just to make you feel good, or is there anything specific that you're focused on there right now?
Yeah, I tend to keep track of how many calories that I've eaten in my head throughout the day. And I counted macros for a couple of years. So I feel like that has been good enough for me and takes minimal effort. Pretty much right now, the emphasis is on try to get enough protein and don't get fat. And that's pretty much it. So I haven't been super strict about it. And I've never been massively focused on nutrition. I tend to be someone who will naturally overeat if given the option to. So I haven't really had to deal with that. Sometimes I've played a little bit with making sure I'm getting more carbs and less fat. I'm not just eating a bunch of ice cream and stuff. But sometimes I am. Like I also love desserts. Yeah, haven't ever been super dialed on that except when I like first got into powerlifting and bodybuilding and stuff and I was just like wanting to look really jacked.
I feel like though, I mean, with your high output, when you have that high output time there, when you're trying even 25 to 30 miles, I know for you that doesn't feel like a lot, but I know for a lot of people that's still a lot. Like your output's pretty high, so it's like you almost, if anything, just need to make sure you're probably fueling enough. We talked about that earlier with some of your guys you work with. I'm assuming making sure you fuel enough is also a challenge at times too. But you said you tend to potentially like overeat, like you could be someone that's a little bit higher risk of overeating, but right, you would still have to focus on making sure you eat enough as well too with your amount of output.
And generally, that is the priority in the list of things, especially because I know the guys are going to get enough protein if they're eating enough because they're eating a lot. So
Yeah,
if you eat 5,000 calories, like I think it'd be hard to not get enough
enough protein.
protein for your needs. So I don't usually emphasize it too much. In the more rare context of someone trying to lose a little bit of weight, then I'll just encourage more protein or a focus on that for a snack or something.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. Real quick, I do want to touch on your dissertation, and I think you just gave a talk at the NSCA. Is that, did those two go together? Was it similar to your dissertation to the talk you did at the NSCA conference?
Yeah, so for NSCA, I was co-presenting with David Church, who is a researcher, and he's done a lot of work with like protein metabolism, muscle physiology, and stuff like that in tactical populations, some work with testosterone, and its effect on protein synthesis and retaining mass and stuff in military populations, doing like selection courses and stuff like that. So we presented together on, we called it Warfighter Health and Human Performance. And we talked about a couple of, we approached it from the view of pre-mission, during mission, and post-mission. So pre-mission being some of the preparatory stuff that you could do pharmacologically in order to enhance mission performance or enhance preparation. During mission, we talked about some of the stuff from my dissertation and some of his research. And for me, that was the use of ketone monoesters for preserving cognition during exercise heat stress. And then we talked a little bit about post-mission consideration. For me, that whole section was what I was actually most excited about. And I tried to go into depth about how much brain injuries affect special operators and what kind of costs that those entail over time, especially over the course of a long career, and then some of the potential treatment options that are out there, which was actually just Ibogaine, which was the treatment that I did in January, and presenting some of the results from the research that has come out very recently on that and how big of an impact that's having. So that, yeah, that was the talk. Whereas the dissertation, I had two studies in it, and one being the ketone monoester and in cognition during heat stress study. And the one I did before that was looking at a combination of caffeine and theacrine in order to help preserve cognition during and following high intensity interval exercise in a tactical population.
Can you maybe hit on ketone esters a little bit in terms of what you found there and yeah, any valuable information there on that?
Yeah. So I was super excited to do that study because it was completely my original idea to test that because ketone monoesters, which are not ketone salts or ketone precursors, like they're the real thing. They're very expensive and they taste like a combination of like liquor and nail polish remover or something, and
Nice.
they have a viscous consistency. So they're atrocious. Yeah, and they're like 30 to $40 a serving if you want like the real benefits. The research had shown that ketones had been helpful for preserving cognition in a few different stressful situations, such as during prolonged like ultramarathon running or during severe hypoxia. So there are already some instances of ketones being helpful for cognition. There is also large interest from the DoD in ketones because of their ability to prevent diving injuries related to oxygen toxicity. And there's also the role that ketones have in helping mitigate damage from a brain injury when taken prophylactically and then taken immediately after the event in the treatment of and for subsequent days following the impact. So there's a bunch of interest around ketone esters already, and I figured I'm really interested in this brain injury stuff, and ketones are helpful for that. So I was thinking, why couldn't ketones be used for hyperthermia? Because what happens during hyperthermia, and it's proposed to be one of the reasons why cognition gets impaired when you overheat, is because you have a reduction in blood flow to the brain. And ketones have been shown in many studies. It's well established that they can increase brain blood flow by a very large margin. So intuitively, I thought if we can prevent the mechanism that causes the drop in cognition during heat stress, then maybe we can preserve cognition. And that is what happened. So in this study, we took fit participants, so they had VO2 maxes over 55, and they weren't a military population. But this was just to try weed out people who weren't going to be able to handle the exercise protocol. We also wanted to make sure that they were going to be safe doing it and they're actually able to tolerate really high core body temperatures. And just for example, the average person, if they get heated to 104 degrees, is probably going to be extremely miserable. But you might have a world-class athlete getting up to 106 who has no indications of heat illness and no major discomfort besides some fatigue. And they're definitely safe at that core temperature. So that would cause a heat stroke for some other individual.
Well, real quick, for that person, is that like an adaptation or is that more a genetic thing or a combination?
Ooh, definitely a trait that can be improved with adaptation, but I would imagine there is some genetic component related to it because there are instances of people developing heat strokes at fairly normal core body temperatures, even though they're pretty fit. But most of the time in fit individuals, you can overheat and you're not going to experience a heat stroke until you get much hotter than that. And that comes because even when you're training hard in cool temperatures, you're overheating like repeatedly. And so if you're doing that all the time, your body's going to get pretty robust at handling that. So yeah, the thought was let's get fit people. We can generalize it a little bit better to special operations. And they came in, we gave them a standardized breakfast, bagel, cream cheese, and banana, and then 4 milligrams per kilogram body mass caffeine. We had them wait for 45 minutes in order to let the caffeine actually get absorbed and let the food digest a little bit. And then we did baseline cognitive testing, which we did a bunch of different cognitive tests. And then we gave them 25 grams of either carbohydrate control or a ketone monoester. And then they started exercise in the heat chamber, which I was pretty proud of this protocol because it was hard and it was, I think, as hard as the school was going to allow me to do. But it was 90 minutes of very fast-paced walking on an incline treadmill. So 5% treadmill, 95 degrees in the heat chamber, average speed of 4.5 miles per hour, and wearing a weight vest that was 20% of their body mass. So about an average of 35 to 40 pounds for the weight vest. So pretty legit exercise protocol. I did it multiple times and I was ruined me for the rest of the day actually. And in the middle of that 90 minutes, we did a midpoint cognitive test. And then at the end, we did another cognitive test. And I forgot to mention, but at that midpoint, we also gave another dosage of the study product, so 25 grams of ketone monoester or carbohydrate. And then at the very end, we did the last cognitive test. After that, we had the participants take off their weight vests and then they did a time to exhaustion test in the heat chamber. And that was at 90% of their velocity at VO2 max. And I think the average speed for that was like 8.8 miles per hour, something around there on a 5% grade still. So pretty tough. And I think the average times for that the average was about 8 minutes. But interestingly, we saw for that time to exhaustion at the end that the ketone condition actually outperformed the carbohydrate condition by almost 27%. So 9 minutes versus 7.1 minutes. So that was very surprising just because there is a lot of literature that would indicate that taking ketone monoesters or being in ketone is going to be disadvantageous for high intensity performance. That could have been due to the combination with caffeine. It could have been due to the heat stress. It could have been the exercise protocol and how we did it, where we didn't give them a ton of calories during it. And then at the end of a pretty hard protocol, then they were asked to do this time to exhaustion. So it could have been any of those factors or something else that I haven't considered yet. But with the main focus of the study being on cognition, we actually saw some very interesting results there. And we had a few different cognitive tasks, including reaction times and two different working memory tasks. And I'll stick with those because I think they're a little bit more interesting and a clearer picture. But we did not see any differences for reaction time. We actually didn't even see reaction times drop through the study, which to me, that suggests that the reaction time test either wasn't hard enough to be affected by that physical exercise, or the exercise was not hard enough to actually impair that trait in this fit population. But when it came to the working memory tasks, which are more difficult, we did see that performance on average dropped, except it was maintained or improved in the ketone condition, and it dropped off much more severely in the carbohydrate condition. And we saw that in both the working memory tasks. And yeah, to us, that wasn't super surprising because working memory is a little bit more complex, and some of those more complex cognitive functions are going to begin to dwindle away a little bit sooner in response to some of that stress. And one of the examples I've given is you wouldn't want to take the hardest, most important exam of your life after running a marathon. You're just going to be tired. It's not going to go as well as you want, and you're not going to perform as well as you can. But if you had to do a 1 minute reaction time test, it may not be super heavily affected unless there's a really big motor component associated with it.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. So again, specifically in heat stress, adding in ketone esters can help preserve cognition, which in turn is obviously going to be super applicable to special operations. Real quick on ketone esters. So my understanding of it is that they're going to basically, it's a way to again to get your body to use that fuel source, but you don't necessarily have to actually do what it takes to get into ketosis in terms of whether that be like a high energy expenditure with a low intake, or again just a super low carbohydrate intake. Is that correct? My thought
Yeah,
process on
you
it.
can maintain your regular diet and drink this really nasty shot, and within 30 to 45 minutes, you're going to start to see a pretty meaningful increase in your blood ketone concentrations. And when you're not exercising, they can stay elevated for a couple of hours. If you exercise, they're going to clear out a little bit faster. But yeah, really, it requires no dietary modifications. And despite that, there has been a decent bit of evidence suggesting that the addition of ketone esters without any other changes, even in the presence of ingestion with carbohydrates, could still impair high intensity performance. And of course, in a special operations context, if in our study we observed that there was a performance detriment at the end, you'd have to very cautiously weigh the risks and the benefits associated with the ketones, right? If you could have improved cognition, but at the cost of impaired physical performance, you might not want to be using that blanketly across all situations. But I think since we saw a benefit with the high intensity performance and we saw improved cognition, at least in this heat stress context, I think it wouldn't be the worst idea to be taking these preemptively on a mission, especially if you're going to be able to ingest it with carbohydrates and even with something else like sodium bicarbonate, which some of the theories around why ketones can impair performance is because they tend to lower blood pH a little bit, and taking an alkalizing agent like sodium bicarbonate could offset that. And that's what the research has shown so far. And my understanding is that's what the highest levels of cycling are doing with their own internal research and with their cyclists in something like the Tour de France. They're actually, if they are taking them during each day's race, they're usually taking it with sodium bicarbonate and carbohydrate.
What about, because beta alanine does the same thing as well too, right?
Mhm.
Like more in the muscle though, from my understanding of that. Would that be something too, or is that just now it's okay? Now we're trying to take a million different things here at this point.
So honestly, I don't know if that research has been done yet, if anyone's tested beta alanine in combination with ketones. Besides the basic effects, like I'm not super familiar with beta alanine. I would suspect that the reason, like at least just first thing that comes to mind with why sodium bicarb has been tested, but beta alanine hasn't, is just because beta alanine has historically been more beneficial for very high intensity performance,
Mm,
whereas sodium bicarb, assuming it doesn't upset your GI tract
yep.
and you're able to ingest it in a way that your GI tract can tolerate and be helpful for some of the endurance
Gotcha.
events. Maybe not the super long ones, but I think some of that's just the result of some of those studies not being done, at least in the populations that need to be studied for it. Because if you could make, even if it's a very small, undetectable difference for the first couple hours of a very long day, if you could offset that by a very small percent or whatever, potentially by the end of that, you're actually a little bit fresher and a little bit better off than you would have been if you hadn't taken the sodium bicarb. And I know some of the really high level endurance athletes, like the Norwegian triathletes, are using sodium bicarbonate in their training too, and in their racing and during really long races as well. So it's not like they're just going off the conventional research recommendations on how to best use sodium bicarb.
Super interesting stuff. So was the other, because I know there was two novel, what was the other, was it three, is that how you say, is it three, how do you say that? Caffeine and
Yeah, so the chemical is it's a
theacrine.
caffeine derivative, but it gets branded as one of the brand names is Theacrine. Yeah, it's always confusing if you're not familiar
Okay.
with it because you've probably seen both and you're like, which is it? Yeah, so that one was basically comparing caffeine, 300 milligrams to a combination of 150 milligrams of caffeine with 150 milligrams of theacrine. And so the total dosages are equivalent, but as anyone listening knows, taking a large dose of caffeine in some people can cause some negative side effects, like it can produce a little bit of jitteriness or anxiety that might be counterproductive for what they're trying to do. And in other people, if they perceive it in a positive way, it might help them. But there's a little bit more unpredictability with high doses of caffeine. And then you also have issues with habituation to it, and you have the issue of it only lasting for a couple hours. So what theacrine does is it works very similar to caffeine, but it has a much longer half-life, and it can even prolong the effects of caffeine in plasma. By taking them together, you potentially get that stimulatory benefit that caffeine provides, but you get it over a longer period of time. And that's actually how it worked out in the study, where both caffeine and the combination did improve cognition compared to a placebo. But 2 hours later, after finishing high intensity exercise, a lot of the benefits that the caffeine condition was experiencing had started to return to baseline, whereas they were still elevated in the combination group. So that's an instance where taking this combination could be really helpful if you do have something that's going to go for more than a couple hours and you do want sustained energy, or you're someone who's more susceptible to some of those undesirable side effects that might come along with high doses of caffeine. So that was interesting. It was cool to have an interesting result in my first dissertation study.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Isn't that kind of similar what the mechanisms are of D9, like D9 caffeine as well too, is the same thing. It's like it like lasts longer almost in a way. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, yes. I think a couple of years ago, I was at a conference and someone was talking about, someone gave a presentation that was sponsored by the company that trademarked the D9 caffeine, something like that. And so
Yeah.
I'd heard of it. I'm not super familiar with how it works, but I think that the idea behind taking that is similar to the idea behind taking the combination, purely based on just what I've heard is I haven't heard anyone say they like the D9 caffeine.
Okay.
I don't know. I haven't heard that many people taking it anyways, and I also haven't heard a ton of people saying they love theacrine. Hard to say for sure, but I would think that the rationale for the D9 caffeine is very similar to why you take the combination.
I would imagine with theacrine, then the big thing just being is like with caffeine, you get that dose right away and it hits you right away. It's like you feel it. Whereas I'm imagining with the theacrine, if you expand it out, you just maybe don't necessarily notice the effects of it like as much potentially from like an acute sense.
Yeah, and I know C4 was one of the earlier pre-workouts to, I think in like C4 Ultimate, they included theacrine in it. And yeah, it's interesting because if you take, if you're someone who's not super habituated to caffeine and you have 300 milligrams, you're definitely going to feel something. if you took 300 milligrams of theacrine, I don't know that you're going to feel nearly as much. And very interestingly, in my personal experience, if I take 300 milligrams of caffeine and then 100 milligrams of theacrine, it will actually feel like less of a stimulant effect than if I just had the 300 milligrams of caffeine. So that's why I suspect that a lot of the pre-workouts that were released with theacrine didn't do as well because it just doesn't it doesn't hit you as hard.
Yep.
And there are a lot of times where I want to feel the caffeine and I want to feel a significant difference from before caffeine and after caffeine, in which case I would not recommend taking a combination with theacrine. But if I were doing a very long workout training for Ironman or something, those were times where I'd pretty routinely take the combination with theacrine because I wasn't worried about having a huge boost right at the beginning.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. As you were talking about this, you said C4 was the first one to do the Theacrine. So they're the ones that have Alpha Bomb, which from my understanding has the D9 caffeine in it there, which is like the only place where I think you can get it right now. I could be wrong on that. I don't know much about it either. I just had Dr. Mike Nelson on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and he was the one that brought it to my attention. I had never heard of it before that. So
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I actually saw an ad on Instagram or something for, the new C4. And I was looking at the reviews because I'd heard mixed things about the D9 caffeine. And the reviews were like pretty negative. And there weren't a ton, but people said they didn't like it. They felt like shit. And it might be because they put 10 grams of beta alanine in it. So they put like some absurd amount of beta alanine.
8 grams.
And that's not going to mess you up if you're real habituated to it. But in my experience, I have tried very high doses of beta alanine for 6 weeks, what's recommended. And I would have 8 to 12 grams throughout the entire day. I wasn't getting any paresthesia or whatever. And I would still sometimes get nauseous from it. So I wonder if that's part of why people aren't feeling so good with that. If the reviews are continuing to be consistently not so positive with the new C4.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize how much beta alanine was in there. Maybe that's their way of making it feel like more like a pre-workout. Because like you said, like when people get pre-workout, at least that was my introduction to it. It's man, that like feeling of just that first time you take that pre-workout, that's like the best feeling is more so that. And I remember there were times where it was like, man, I want something with the most caffeine in it. And most of these things now, back when I first started taking pre-workouts, I felt like anything over 200 was a lot. I took Jack's. That was my intro to pre-workout. Now I feel
best
like
one.
Yeah. Now I feel like all the pre-workouts are like 400 milligrams plus almost at this point.
Yeah, they're pretty high dosages. And that's something I'll have phases where I build up my tolerance a little bit too high and then I have to really back off.
Awesome, man. Really appreciate your time. Ton of great stuff. I'm looking forward to some of your work that you're going to continue to do and everything like that moving forward. We didn't really get to talk about Ibogaine and your TBI, but we'll have to save that for another time there, man. But really appreciate your time and a ton of great information here. Where can people find out more about you and give you follow and things like that?
I've got an Instagram. My handle is at Blainekit. So it's like a blanket that
I get it now.
that you wear, but spelled like my name. So it's BLAINEKETS. I don't have a LinkedIn or anything like that, but I'm usually pretty responsive if people reach out on Instagram.
Yeah, awesome, man. Really appreciate your time, and we'll chat with you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.